About 2 weeks ago, a coworker and I random conversation resulted in this topic idea. It's something that I hadn't thought about in this manner, so I guess this conversation helped me polish it. What I have thought about before is you inherit stuff from your ancestors that goes beyond just physical traits. Sometimes I believe in things like you'll inherit whatever it was that might have been haunting an ancestor. And by haunting, I mean unresolved matters. Sometimes I feel like that's something that you just cannot escape unless you take the proper action to escape from it. I'm 100% a believer in those things, even if it's an ancestor from like a century ago. I still believe that they can have the potential to mess me up somewhere. I just wanted to introduce to you the relationship I have had with what I am getting ready to say. I have always thought that you can also inherit thoughts. Why wouldn't you inherit thoughts? I understand that thought is an ability obtained by how you, I guess, train your mind. You know how if you work out and you run a lot, then you're more likely to be able to run for extended periods of time. But it's also preferable that you train based on what kind of body you have, what type of body you have, what type of muscle configuration you have, because otherwise, for instance, I could aspire to lift as much as my boyfriend could lift when he was legally swole, but I know that there's no way that I can achieve that because we have our differences. I do not know what kind of athlete I'm meant to be. Sometimes I think I'm supposed to be a swimmer. That's how I look at the mind. You are configured in a way to where you will excel in some things but not others. That's why they have these so-called learning styles or intelligence styles. They are the people who can learn a ton of languages. They are people who just know shit without you actually telling them, a stronger sense of intuition. Others are better with numbers, others can recognize patterns, decipher codes. The other people can do things such as art. They see something, they remember what they see, and they're able to translate it with detail and accuracy onto a piece of paper. I think it's important that I define those details so that I can define what I'm getting ready to say a little better, because I feel like if I just say it the way that I was thinking of it, it won't be as organized. My coworker and I were talking about how you feel sometimes like you receive information that you know you're receiving for the first time, but somehow you knew it. I told her that I tend to have some kind of weird premonition abilities. There are some things that I can just see coming, and sometimes they manifest exactly how I pre-witnessed them, even though they haven't happened. And then I explained to her that my great-grandfather had a similar thing going on, and he was especially good at foretelling the condition of some of his animals before they were born. He wasn't a vet, of course. How would he know those things? Sometimes he knew that a calf would be born with a deformity before the cow even had this creature. Now, my coworker said that she has a lot of deja vu. And then I asked her, I clearly, definitely, undoubtedly believe in that. But what do you think is the cause? Because sometimes I feel like I legit can finish some of my mom's memories, even though I wasn't around for some of the things that she's saying. It's like I can vividly have the picture in my mind. The only thing I may not get right is the appearance of someone. Say, if she was telling me a story of someone she knew in college, maybe I'll be envisioning this college friend to be similar to me in phenotype, but they turn out to be the complete opposite. They turn out to be tall, they turn out to be lighter or darker than me, or buffer, whatever, you name it, those little differences, or even smaller than I am. My coworker said, I have a lot of deja vu. And then I'm like, I can't say that I have that at least once a day, because sometimes I see something happening that I'm like, didn't I see you already? Didn't I do this for you? And sometimes I like to think that it's simply since I work customer service and a lot of our customers are repeat customers and they seem to get the same fucking thing, their total seems to be about the same. They bring the same supplies, like they have the same wallet, they have the same pair of glasses, their same shopping bag if they in some cases bring their own. And I think, well, maybe that's what I was seeing. Maybe I have done this before, because I have done this before. I have told them this same total, but with price changes, of course, it'll be slightly different. When you expose yourself to this routine so much, then I think that it just turns into that. But she was also describing how she experiences that everywhere she goes, which these premonition powers that I'm talking about, I can say I feel everywhere I go as well. And sometimes it even happens when I'm driving. I will go like, you know what, fuck it, let me take a different route this time. And it turns out that had I not done that, miles ahead, there was backed up traffic because of a wreck or construction, something like that. And I'll be like, oh, dodged a bullet. Not always, of course, because I have been stuck in traffic before. Another thing that has happened is when I have ignored my urge to take the detour or take the alternative route, but because I didn't, now I have to suffer the consequences of my disobedience, because had I acted upon my instinct, which I wasn't summoning, I'm just fucking driving, why would I do that? Then had I detoured, I would have skipped all that inconvenience. Now, this is the part that I was most excited about, that my coworker said that finally planted this idea in me. She said, well, but when you think about it, we have existed within our mothers since their conception. And the reason she said that is because I also commented that I could never understand why I felt like I inherited some of the troubles that my grandparents had. Not mom, but grandparents. And then I thought, well, maybe I feel that way because my grandparents raised my mom, and my mom has shared a lot of what her experience was. Who's to say that because we're at close proximity, close relatedness, that something like that isn't gonna affect us or hit us? I think that human beings, because of how we are developed and our cognitive capacity, who's to say that we cannot be sensitive to that type of thing? My coworker goes, sometimes I feel like it all boils down to the fact that we have been hanging out with our moms since they were born. And that made a lot of sense, because then I stopped for a second and I said, well, when you put it like that, I can't help but think that sometimes I feel old. When I was a kid, by the time I was 8 years old, I felt like I was old because I was always getting told that I'm too mature for my age and things like that. And looking back, I'm looking at it as, oh, okay, I had a lost childhood because I had to grow at an accelerated rate given my circumstances. But why do we actually feel that way? We know it's not true that we're old at 8 years old, but mentally and emotionally, we are manifesting things that seem possible and reserved only for older people. So then she said, well, I feel like I've been existing since, I think she said 1933. You know, when I was an egg, I was hanging out with my mom the whole time. Who's to say that I haven't obtained 50% wisdom and abilities, even if my, I guess you could say, brain cells, brainstem, wasn't even developing because the other 50% hadn't been introduced. And then I thought, well, when you put it like that, could we also say that I have been existing since the 1920s as well, or 1930s as well? Because my grandma, she had my mom going with her everywhere. By that logic, 50% of my mom, what would become my mom, whatever traumas and shocks and skills, things like that my grandma was experiencing, some of that information made it to the egg. And then when the egg finally received my grandfather's information, then it developed into what my mom became. But people would dismiss this because you technically cannot retain info like that because you were not a being that had the functions of a person yet. You weren't even a zygote. You were smaller than the period at the end of a sentence. That couldn't possibly have an effect. But I'm like, oh, okay, well, you're saying that because something is small in size compared to what another opposing force is, say, a child hitting someone who is fit, it's probably not going to have much of an effect because it's just a child. Who's to say that a little dot living inside a person, you know it exists because we know that women are born with a preset number of eggs. Who's to say that you're not already affecting those eggs? They recommend that you don't smoke. They recommend that you don't drink, especially when you're gestating already. Who's to say that even before the egg experiences like that lead up to conception can't experience those things? Who's to say that I cannot affect the quality of my eggs from age 12 up until whenever the last one that I have is scheduled to go for it one more time, produce uterine lining, and then be eliminated from my body, and now I have to run into menopause. See what I mean? All those little details I'm taking the time to express so that you understand the whole picture. I know I don't have the info very well organized. This is my first time ever actually putting it into words. I've never even journaled about this, I don't think, before. But if I have been partly existing, then who's to say that when my parents finally actually conceived me, some of their life experiences cannot turn into my memories? Because I have their information, both of them coming together, and they happen to be from the same town. They happen to be from, I guess, professions that are deemed pillars in society. Like one was a cop, one was a teacher. Those are professions that have influenced people for a long time. Who's to say that when they get together and I'm conceived, that some of that stuff becomes something that I inherit? And to illustrate my point, I once wanted to be a policewoman, even though I hate my dad. And I once wanted to be a teacher. I once wanted to be a flight attendant. I once wanted to be a lawyer. And I never understood where my interest came from when I hated social studies. Then eventually I said I wanted to be a judge. And I'm like, why do I keep feeling interest in those fields that I have nothing to do with? Because I never liked social studies classes up until my sophomore year in high school. And then it wasn't until years later that I discovered that on my father's side, there are lawyers. And I thought, oh, that makes a ton of sense now. Maybe if I would have had that information when I was younger, it would have made sense to me why mom would say that some of the questions I ask her, some of the thoughts that I tell her are social studies topics. But just because I don't like the class doesn't mean I cannot like the topic of social studies. It wasn't until social studies became branched out, say called civics or called economics or US history. Once those topics became focused and specialized, then my interest was able to, I guess, flourish in a way that made sense. When it comes to science, of course, that's both sides of the family. But I think my maternal side might be a little stronger. But at the same time, on my father's side, there have been some family members who ended up doing things. That brings me back to the point that I was trying to say about ancestors whose messes I may be haunted by and I may have inherited without asking for it or without having anything to do with it. Because what I just described sounds to me like inherited interests that if I were to have my skills honed in it, you will see that I can specialize on that because I have a natural ability for it. But where did that come from? And I think when you have a lineage already backing you up, you have no choice but to excel at this unless you inherit something else. Say, another ability my grandma has is she's a very good cook, but I don't remember hearing of official chefs and cooks in the family. But maybe I never heard of that because that was coming from females, and females back in the olden days, what could we really do? We really didn't have an education, we didn't have jobs, careers that we could pursue like we can in modern days. But just because we couldn't, it doesn't mean that we didn't have potential. And this is one of the reasons why I hate it when we are treated and described as you gotta be submissive. And I'm like, no, there's no way that I can allow anyone to dominate me because I know that I possess abilities that I need to develop, but my access to that development is limited. But just because my access to that development is limited doesn't mean that my potential is not there at all. That little comment, those like 6 sentences that I exchanged with my coworker completely led up to this train of thought. I like that because this is stuff that I don't think you can really quantify. You can describe your experience, you can describe your feeling, and maybe if you're exposed to a certain set of circumstances and certain stressors, it can be brought out of you. But it's hard to prove that this is a thing when you don't have a material evidence to back you up. Except, say, I was able to avoid a traffic jam due to a wreck because I had a weird feeling to act on taking a detour as opposed to committing to my intended route. All in all, I do think that you can begin to inherit information in the same manner that you can inherit physical consequences from whoever carries you, say, as an egg, your mom, for instance. If she is a smoker and a drinker, she has the potential of damaging you before you're even conceived. And if your father is no good either, if he's a smoker, a drinker, and has a poor diet, then the other 50% of you, when it mixes with the other 50% from your mom, whether your mom was healthy or unhealthy, you already are carrying the scars from your dad's habits. But we don't talk about it like that because unless you are born with consequences, suffering from something, then we don't take into account what were this person's habits like before they became parents. We only think about where the issue came from if the issue is visible. But if you happen to be born just fine from parents that had bad habits, it seems like you have a timer going on with you. Maybe you will not manifest any symptoms, any cognitive issues, but maybe you'll have them physically. Maybe you don't have physical issues, but then eventually you'll develop cognitive issues, or those issues will become apparent during your development stages when you're a child. I sometimes do feel like I have an answer now for those times in my past when I always felt like I was acting older than I truly was, and I just felt older than I truly was. And when I think about it, I like this as a potential answer. I like to think, well, whatever my mom was into, a little bit of that made it to me. Because sometimes I wonder, well, as a modern person, growing up with modern sounds, modern music influencing me, I understand that liking music is something that's subjective. What you like about music is subjective. But how come a lot of the things that she liked in her youth are things that I like? Almost inherently, I didn't have to try to grow into the music that she liked. I just liked it. And you know what else? My dad also liked and grew up with the same music because, like I said, they're from the same hometown. They were listening to the same stuff. And whatever trends they had at their time, they had that pretty much in common. So who's to say that these two compatible people in that regard didn't plant in me those interests? Because given their close compatibility, then I had no choice but to inherit that stuff. I hope that this made sense. I really, really, really tried my best to illustrate it with not necessarily all of the nuance that goes into it, but at least that I was able to express how many points had to connect for me to believe in the potential for this to be a thing. When you take the time to actually break it down for me like this, it changes my perspective a little bit, because I like to think that I don't have a lot in common with folks from those decades. But when I think about it, yeah, when I was taught by some of them, I was taught by people who were born in the late 30s, potentially early 40s. Some of them were my teachers. And I also had teachers from all of the decades that followed after, who's to say that the folks who were teaching me, who were from those older decades, were teaching the people who are my parents' age, and they either became the parents of my parents' age group, or they themselves were the people who maybe were taught by people from an even earlier decade, like someone from the 20s. Not everybody is going to be from my same age group. And sometimes there are people who have parents who are only 15 years older than they are. Your parent is almost the same generation as you are. So I think that's why it's important to have those distinctions in demographics. You have the lost generation, but then you have the greatest generation, but then you have the baby boomers, and then you have, I don't know the order, but your Gen Xers and all that. I mean, I think that classifying you is a good start at organizing certain things, but it's definitely not the answer to everything. And sometimes I think I was also influenced by folks who would have been the children of my parents immediately, but also I think that they could have been almost classmates, because some of these kids, if you have a school that's like K through 12, then you had the potential of running into these little kids even when you were an older kid. You still had the potential of running into people who are children, but you're on your way out of the school system, but you get to spend time within the same school system. Like, we're just shared. A lot of the things we're doing is shared and connected. I'm just trying to illustrate the connection, and how the connection, I think, begins way before conception. So there you guys have it. That's it from me on this one. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will probably come back to this topic in the future to express any thoughts that may have organized themselves a little better and I have more clarity about this. We can take it from there.